Story 1. When I was a kid in the mid-90s, my friends and I were hiking around in the woods behind our house on some wire house or timber property and found an abandoned farmhouse. The weird thing was that the house had been left very suddenly. There was still unopened mail and magazines sitting on the coffee table, all dated back to the same date in the 1950s. Sheets and blankets were still on the beds, clothes were still in the drawers, pantry was full of canned and jarred food. Half of it exploded or leaked after so many years. Dishes in the sink, dishes on the table. Unburned candles still sitting out waiting to be used. A fridge outside was full of food that had turned to muck and dust. After exploring the house for a while, we checked out the farm. The chicken coop had dozens of chicken skeletons, wrapped in desiccated skins or picked bare. There were 2 pig skeletons in a pen and the remains of a horse and several cows in the surrounding pasture. A tractor was parked in the garage and was in great shape for its age. It didn't occur to me as a kid at the time, but aside from the house having been left so suddenly, it was really remarkable that the entire place was undisturbed. There was no vandalism, no sign of entry, and as far as I could tell, we were the first people to set foot in there in 40 years. Story 2, I had a relative who would seek out ghost towns and I went with him on a few of his excursions. Most of the time, you would find one that was relatively well known. Things were overgrown, but there would be signs of squatters, campers, hunters, vandalism, etc. One time he found out about a very small town that was abandoned in the 20s. After a ton of research, he loaded up supplies and planned a hike to see if he could find it. After several unsuccessful solo attempts, he brought me along. The hike started out at an old abandoned railroad junction that was itself 5 to 10 miles off the road. We followed a rail line for about 5 miles that kept diminishing as we went. Eventually, we got to a point where there was no longer any sign of the railroad line, and we kept going. He was an experienced hiker, and he had a plan where he wanted to go this time. After about 15 or so more miles, we found it. The town itself was very small. I think there were about 5 houses and a really small general store, I think about the size of a small convenience store. The rooms of the houses were in relatively decent condition, and a couple of them had been abandoned very quickly. Furniture and pictures left behind, clothes and other belongings packed but not taken, etc. It was surreal. We found a letter that was dated 1922, which was about the time that he speculated that the town was abandoned. The store had some products left on the shelves, but this was not like a store in the traditional sense, maybe more like a trading post. There were a few advertising signs and a few boxes of soap flakes and canned items that we couldn't make out. I guess the story was that the town existed because it was on a rail line. There was a grain storage facility that originally was located a few miles away on the rail line. My uncle speculated that the people in the town either owned or ran the grain facility. The grain facility burned down and the rail line was diverted away. Thus the little town died. Or it could have been that the rail line diverted and then the grain facility burned down later. Either way, like I said, I've been to a few ghost towns before. This was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The people that lived there were relatively well off, not rich necessarily. This did not appear to be a farming community like you'd expect. Everything just looked frozen in time. There were no roads anywhere nearby. The closest paved road was probably 30 miles away. It is possible that we were one of a handful of people who saw that place since it was abandoned. This place was out in the middle of nowhere. My uncle found out about the town by seeing a reference to it on a very old railroad map. Again, these were railroad lines that hadn't been used in over 50 years. Story 3. I was hiking in some woods on a property my father rented as a farm ground with my older brother. After a while, we noticed a sickly sweet smell. Being farm kids, we knew what it was. Something dead and left to rot. As we kept walking, we entered a marsh-like area, soft, squishy ground, and very tall grass. We had walked through marsh-like areas before, so we walked on the large grass clumps, being very careful where we placed our feet. After making it to a large clump of solid ground, I look up and find a massive pile of skinned animal carcasses. The pile was easily over 10 feet tall, with a 15-foot circumference. It comprised every animal you could think of: rabbit, fox, coyote, deer, weasel, cat, dog, raccoon, and others I couldn't recognize. The old man who owned the land was trapped year-round for anything he could get. He just kept throwing the carcasses in the same pile year after year. After we left the area, it dawned on me that the marsh was not in a lowland like most marshy places. The group was just saturated with the decaying fluids of all those animals. That's also the reason the grass was abnormally tall in that area. Story 4. When I was a kid, I went to a summer camp that would take older campers, 12, 14, on excursions like a canoe trip and/or a hike for about a week at a time. It was located in Massachusetts, so we did a lot of hiking along the Appalachian Trail. On one hike, there was a group of about 7 girls and 2 counselors, 19, 20-year-old. I'll never forget that one morning we were hiking along the trail and ran into a random guy who was alone, sleeping stark naked in the middle of the trail. Now, you can't camp on the trail on the AT. Everyone who hikes it knows that. You've got to camp in designated areas. This guy clearly didn't get the memo, so we carefully sidestepped him and continued on our way. About 12 miles later, we get to our site for the night, and this dude is already there. Weird, considering we didn't see anyone pass us throughout the day. The whole night, he's really friendly, telling us things like, "My father owns these woods." "Oh yeah? Yeah, he's your father too." Weird shit. At one point, one of our counselors mentions that the site axe is missing. It was there when we arrived, and when she went to use it for firewood, it was gone. The guy had a knife collection he was keen on sharing with us, so it was pretty clear he was the one who took the axe. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, he was gone. Terrifying. Story 5. I went camping with my girlfriend at a very large provincial park a week before Canada Day, several years back. When we arrived, we were delighted to find out that we basically had the whole park to ourselves, as we were told by the ranger who issued our pass. Furthermore, we were camping on an island that took about 1 hour to canoe out to, isolated with no other sites really nearby. A couple of days into our trip, we decided to take an extended canoe trip around the lake. Upon return from a distance out, I noticed something on the shore of our campsite. As we got closer, we realized it was another canoe, which was very odd as there was no one else occupying the other island sites, and the park was essentially empty. Finally, as we were about 30 meters away, we saw 3 people poking around our stuff. They hadn't seen us yet, and were just sort of enjoying looking at our campsite. After a bit, they noticed us, rushed into their boat, and launched into the lake. We were only a couple of feet apart as they came out, and we went in. I was feeling super weird, obviously, at this moment, and just said, "Hey, what's up?" Not in the friendliest tone. I got a good look at them all at that point, and they were a bunch of teens straight out of the movie Deliverance. Slack-jawed, toothless, and generally unpleasant to gaze upon. They didn't say anything to us, but sort of just stared. Very, very intensely. We got to our shore and checked our stuff out to make sure they hadn't stolen anything, which they hadn't. But after the inspection, I looked back to the lake, and they were just sitting there a way out looking at us. Eventually they left, and my girlfriend and I had a really uncomfortable day thinking about it. We slept with the hatchet in the tent and barely caught a wink as we were waiting for them to show back up. Thankfully, we didn't see them for the rest of our trip. Story 6. This happened about 6 years ago. As stated, I was about 12, and my brother was 26 at the time. My brother had been serving in the U.S. Army for several years when this happened, and was deploying to the Middle East on his second deployment, if I remember correctly. Also of note was that he is a Green Beret and had recently 3 or 4 months prior to this trip completed the Army Special Forces qualification course, Robin Sage and all that, and by then was an active duty SF engineer sergeant. Definitely not someone you'd want to fuck around with. Given that we both grew up with a passion for the outdoors, he thought it would be nice to take me on a backpacking trip in northern Alabama, the Sipsey Wilderness, for those familiar with the area, before he left for 9 months. The trip had gone smoothly up until the 3rd night we were camping out. Around 8 p.m., we had our camp set up, eaten dinner, and were sitting by the fire talking about typical boy shit. Guns, girls, etc. For some reference, our spot was about 50 yards from a large stream, and about 50 yards downhill adjacent to the large path. Our camp, the stream, and the path formed a triangle of sorts. This was summertime in Alabama, so it wasn't quite dark yet when 2 guys, who looked to be in their late 20s, wandered up and asked if we had seen any hogs while we were hiking around. Given that this is rural Alabama, we actually had seen some farther into the wilderness area and told them so. Even though they were relatively polite, my brother called them good old boys. I got a seriously creepy vibe from them: dirty clothes, greasy hair, scraggly facial hair, etc. I think they probably looked like they belonged in the movie Deliverance. They kind of hung out for a few minutes, maybe a little longer than they should have, looking around, asking us questions like how long we had been out there, how long we were staying, and what looked like them kind of sizing us up. They then abruptly said goodbye and walked away. I didn't necessarily feel threatened by them, and I know for sure my brother didn't, but I still felt uneasy about the whole thing. Fast forward 3 or 4 hours. My brother and I had gone to sleep and were nestled in our tent when I woke to the sound of multiple dogs barking. I've always been a heavy sleeper, and they sounded like they were only about 100 yards away. My heart immediately started pounding, and I kicked my brother through my sleeping bag and asked if he was awake, had heard the dogs. He responded, "I'm awake. They've been getting closer for the past hour or so. Just lay still and don't make any sounds." Needless to say, 12-year-old me was about to shit my pants. We would also hear sporadic shouts from several different sources, but neither came any closer. A few minutes later, my brother whispered, "They're just hunting for hogs. They use the dogs to pin them down, and then they shoot them." This gave me some relief, but not much. Somehow I managed to fall back asleep. The fact that they were doing this at night was a huge red flag, my brother later told me, but I think he was just trying to keep me calm. Fast forward what was probably another 3 hours, around 2 a.m. I had managed to sleep pretty well after first hearing the hog hunters when I woke up to my brother squeezing my shoulder firmly, saying, "Wake up, put your shoes on quick and follow me, be as quiet as you can." My heart immediately went back to racing because I heard the dogs and voices in the distance, farther away than before but still distinct. Not asking any questions, I did what he said, and as soon as we were out of the tent, he told me to get on his back. So this was a breeze for him after rucking with God knows how much weight in the Army. We snuck about 50 yards into the woods towards the junction of the path and the stream and crawled into some bushes. It was up a hill, so we had a pretty good elevated view of our campsite. I remember as we were laying there how loudly I was breathing and how quiet he was when I heard the very distinct sound of a pistol slide racking. I looked over and my brother had his pistol, a HK USP that he gave to me a few years after this story took place, and was watching the campsite and surrounding area. I started to whisper to him when he put his hand over my mouth and pointed at the campsite. The group of hunters had been steadily approaching our camp, and by this time, 30 or so minutes, had reached it. There were 5 of them and like 3 or 4 dogs. They all looked relatively young, but 2 had either rifles or shotguns, and the dogs were going crazy, obviously having smelled our scent. For those of you who are backpackers campers, nobody who comes up on a random camp in the middle of the night with dogs and guns and has good intentions. I knew this, and my brother knew this. I was scared shitless. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but my brother later told me they were talking about us, although he hadn't heard any specifics either. They lingered for about 20 minutes, shining flashlights around and talking to themselves when my brother put his mouth to my ear and said, "If they come towards, I want you to turn and run as quickly as you can. Don't stop, don't look back. Stay off the trail and look for the flashing lights." And I didn't know what he meant by this, but that'll come later. I knew I could make it back because he had taught me land nav pretty well. He then handed me a flashlight and told me not to take the red filter off. He told me later that the red filter helps preserve night vision and cuts down ambient light so it would be harder for someone to see from a distance. At this point, I was so scared I almost started crying, but at the same time had a rush of adrenaline and what I think now was confidence that he thought I could handle myself. We lay there for a while longer when out of nowhere they started screaming, "Where Yallet?" and firing into the woods at random. My brother dragged me back behind the crest of the hill and threw himself on top of me. Thankfully, our position on top of the hill, we were protected from any gunfire. They shot maybe 5 or 6 more times and then started walking back the direction they had come. They got maybe 100 yards away when I heard a blaring siren and saw emergency lights flashing through the woods. Turns out my brother had called the Forest Service office on a satellite phone my family has for emergencies while I was asleep, and they had sent out Forest Service officers and game wardens to our area of the wilderness. The Sipsey Wilderness is about 25,000 acres in size, so it took them a while to get there on the dirt roads. When we saw the game warden truck, my brother signaled them with the light and pointed them in the direction the hunters had gone, and the guy sped off, shining his spotlight through the woods. As soon as they were all gone, we went back to our camp, packed up our shit, and waited by the path for the game warden to come back, who then gave us a ride in his truck bed back to the main staging area. On the drive back, my brother told me how brave I had been and that we would talk about it with our parents the next day if I wanted to. I asked him not to do that because I thought they might never let me go camp again. Creepy rednecks in the woods, let's not meet again, you might get shot next time. Follow-up, we never got any definitive information on what happened to the rednecks we encountered. I have many friends who have gone out to the Sipsey area and had a great time with no creepy stuff going on. However, it is truly a wilderness area and law enforcement response, if you can even reach them, would be slow. I was lucky that my brother was there and reacted so quickly, otherwise, who knows what could have happened. We also got lucky that whatever their intentions were, they either reconsidered or lost interest. I will note that when they left our camp, the game warden showed up pretty soon afterwards. But I didn't see what the guys and their dogs did. If I remember correctly, they headed in a direction parallel to the stream, away from the trail, inaccessible to any kind of vehicle. Maybe the warden continued on and took another trail to try and cut them off. We waited around 30 minutes for him to come back, and he said there were other officers out looking. There are only so many paths that you could take a truck or quad bike down, so any thorough search effort would also have to be done on foot. Story 7. My dad's family is from the American Southwest, an area called the Llano Estacado. It's got a pretty rich history now that I think of it. It looks like a barren desert, but the area is chock full of dinosaur bone discoveries, Stone Age people, and more recently, it's where the conquistadors traveled through. Anyway, I guess maybe 40 years ago, my grandpa bought some land and built a house out there, 45 minutes away from any other town. They ran cattle on the land, and the first summer, my dad was way out in a pasture by himself at the age of 15. He lived in a school bus that had been converted a bit to be a little camper, had a bed and stuff. He was basically a shepherd for a young crop of calves. There was no electricity, and he only saw his family once a week when Grandpa would drive out there to pick him up for church on Sunday mornings. The bus didn't run, it was just a shelter. My dad doesn't talk about it too much. One time he opened up about it. He and I were helping a farmer with his wheat crop, and we were taking a break talking. He said he killed at least one rattler every day. At night, he could feel lots of tiny feet of the mice running over him in his bunk. He would lay on the hood of the bus and read Louis L'Amour books till the sun went down. It sounded so cool to me, like from a different time or world. I couldn't imagine being alone that much, and he had no phone either, obviously. Anyways, as you might surmise from this story, my dad grew up to be a pretty tough character. He's the strongest man I know mentally and physically. He's a vet, runs a mechanic shop, and rides motorcycles all across the country. He doesn't put up with bull or nonsense. He's a religious man, but I've never known him to be anything other than serious, realistic, and unsuperstitious, except for the superstition of heaven and God. But you see what I mean. So when he looked down at the ground that day we were talking, scuffed his boot, and said he knew there were ghosts out there, I was shocked. I asked what he meant, and he said just ghosts of the past. After another pause, he said one night, 3 skeletons ran through his campsite. He gave no more details and has never repeated the word since. But he said he would take me out there if I wanted to go. We still lived in the area, so that evening we knocked off work early and drove out there. Now the house is long since gone. There's an Air Force base nearby, and they have a bombing range out there now. After my grandpa built the house, they extended the bombing range, and they were forced off the land. Built a big pit and bulldozed the house into it. Needless to say, trespassers aren't welcome. But my dad wanted to show me the old bus, and this was near the edge of the range. The area is not patrolled or anything. Most people have the common sense to see the words booming range and stay out. But they hardly fly out there and practice bombing every day. You can hear them when they do, and that day had been quiet. So we drove out there as far as we could and then got out of the truck and started walking. There was no one around for miles. We get to the old bus around sunset. I remember the feel of the place. Maybe it was my imagination from what my dad had said, but it felt strange. I can't find the words for it. It just felt different from anywhere I'd ever been. Not creepy exactly, but heavy, if that makes sense. I went into the old bus and opened a cabinet. Damn near had a heart attack. There was a screeching cry and batting wings as a large owl took flight into my face. I screamed and hit the deck. Have you seen the talons or beaks on these guys? But the owl made a U-turn and went out a rusted hole in the back of the cabinet. Inside, though, was a truly gruesome sight. There were 3 baby owlets inside. There were owl pellets everywhere, the regurgitated bones of rodents and the like. It stunk. And these babies, mind you, were not cute, scraggly and covered in greasy clumps of matted feathers in some places, and bald red skin in others. And they were gathered around the corpse of the 4th owlet, pecking it and tearing pieces of meat off. Cannibal owls? No thanks. Exiting the bus, my dad showed me an old grain pit. He lifted the old wood boards covering it and tossed a rock inside. A chorus of rattling met our ears. Couldn't see inside, but it was full of rattlesnakes. I backed off so fast and still shudder at the Indiana Jones-type nightmare that would have ensued if those boards gave way and I was dropped inside. The last strange thing we saw was a single cactus. It was unlike any cactus I have ever seen anywhere, before or since. Out there we have jumping cactus, yucca, prickly, and maybe a barrel cactus or 2, no segros. This was none of those types and was not native. It had grown large and sprawling, twisted green growth covered in tines. It had the most brilliant blood-red flowers. We set off back to the truck after that. The sun was dropping. I know this story isn't on par with the more scary ones on here, but altogether it was one of the most eerie experiences I ever had. It didn't make sense when he said it, but I think I get what my dad meant now by ghosts of the past. Story 8, I live in Utah. I went hiking up on the Bonneville Shoreline Trail that used to be the shore of Lake Bonneville ages ago. This day I picked a different trail to follow, one I'd never been on before. After hiking for a few miles up this trail, I came around a bend and I saw 2 trees that had apparently been uprooted or fallen, and they were placed over the trail in a way that made it look like an archway. That by itself wasn't weird, but there were 2 big elk skulls placed on the end of each tree, placed just so that the empty eye sockets of the skull were looking directly at you as you passed under on the trail. I thought that was kind of weird, but you know, whatever, probably just some people thinking they're funny. I shrugged it off and kept going. But as soon as I passed through the threshold of the archway, a cold chill shot up my spine and I felt my hackles rise instantly and goosebumps all over my body. I kept going for a little while because I didn't want to go back yet, but the whole time I was walking, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. It had me feeling really tense. I walked for a good 10 minutes before I decided to turn around. As I'm walking back, maybe 5 minutes later, it gets really quiet very suddenly. All the birds stop chirping, all the little animals around stop moving, and it even seemed like the wind died down at that moment too. Total silence. My dad was a real big hunter when I was younger, so I'm very familiar with the idea that sudden quiet in the wilderness generally equals sign bad news. By this point, I had a white knuckle grip on the hilt of my big survival knife as I kept walking down the trail. I passed through the archway again and honestly broke into a full-on sprint. I didn't see anything, but there was something there. I was being stalked. I could feel the eyes still, even as I ran away down the trail. I haven't been back to that trail since that day. I don't know what it was that was stalking me that day, but there was something there, and I don't want to find out what. Story 9. It was my 12th birthday, and my friends and I took a very long walk through the woods near my house. After a while, we came upon a farmhouse, which we later learned had been abandoned for close to 20 years. We had to hack our way through the overgrowth. Upon reaching the house, we realized that the front porch had collapsed and the door was locked, so we decided to go around the side to look through the windows. The windows were too high up for us to easily see inside, so we took turns lifting each other up to have a peek. The first window went into the kitchen, where we could see that everything had been left behind, most notably this old Yoda mug. How could we not be interested? So we made our way further around the side of the house, ducking under limbs and briars until we found the door to the back porch. One of my friends tried to go through it, but it didn't lead to anything. That was kind of weird, and I'm still not sure what the purpose of that room was. But after her near miss at getting inside, My friend insisted we find another way in. So we kept walking, turning the corner around to the back of the house. We were just about to step up to the next window when we noticed an odd heap at the base of the foundation. It turned out to be a dead calf with its eyes missing. It had not been dead for more than a couple of days, or we would have smelled it. But since we were in a rural wooded area with other farms nearby, we figured it had just wandered off. Even though none of those farms had cows, just fields. My friend was really obsessed with getting that Star Wars mug, so she convinced us to look in the window despite the dead cow. During another visit a few years later, I would nickname it the room with the moose, which is an Invader Zim reference. I was the least interested, so I was the last to look in the window. And when I did, we heard shuffling sounds coming from inside, and I swear I saw a pair of shadows move across the wall. And that was the last straw. I let go of the rotting windowsill, and as soon as my feet hit the ground, I ran. I could hear my friends calling to me, begging me to come back so we could try to get inside and explore further. But I was done. I ran back through the mess of old bushes, climbed over 2 fallen trees, and discovered the remains of an old rusty swing set on my way out. It didn't make me feel any better about things. I kept running until I reached the dirt road that led to the woods, and there I sat and waited for my friends to catch up. As soon as they did, they began begging me to go back and explore. But I refused, so we went back to my house where we all spent the night. Eventually, I gave in and agreed to go back the next day. Upon returning, we found that the calf had been picked clean down to the bone. We did not live in an area with wolves or coyotes. At that point, we were all done with the house. The reason I have photos is because we went back later when we were teenagers. We found evidence of drug use inside, so maybe there were squatters. Or maybe it really was haunted.